I'm your host, John Byrne with AML Right Source. And with me today, I'm very excited to have this conversation with one of the early interviews that we did when we first started doing AML conversations is Paul Camacho. Paul is the Vice President of Compliance at Yamava Casino Resorts in California. And he also spent a good portion of early part of his career at the Internal Revenue Service and IRS CI. So he's another one of those great investigators that moved on to the private sector. And we're going to talk to him about that and some of the challenges and some of what he's learned, because he left there way back in 2014. But so he's been working in the casino industry for quite a long period of time. Paul is also a very prolific author for ACAMS Today. He's written many articles. He was writing as far back as when I was running ACAMS years ago. And they're always insightful, but they also always give AML practitioners like myself and others that aren't in the gaming industry a better appreciation of an area that's not necessarily unique, but it's certainly different than traditional financial institutions. So, Paul, thanks so much for taking some time today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, glad to be here.
Let's start it this way. We're going to go in depth in some of the issues that AML professionals in gaming have to navigate. But what is it that those of us that are in the AML space, not in gaming, don't quite grasp about the challenges that you folks face doing compliance and due diligence and all the things that you have to do as an AML professional in gaming?
Well, in terms of what we have to grasp and what are our big risks, one of the things that that a lot of people outside of the casino industry don't really understand is the most common way illicit funds enter a casino is simply through criminals enjoying funds, simply enjoying funds. So, they could also try to be laundering their money, but most of the time they are spending the fruits of their crimes. And so source of funds becomes a really important aspect. The other thing too is we're not like a bank. We don't have their bank statements. We're not monitoring the account. We see the egg outside, but we don't see what's in. So it's hard for us to trend analysis whether somebody is, transactionally, is it congruent to their activity? So, that gets into like, what's the difference between a doctor that really likes gambling and a criminal that really likes gambling? Now, most of the time their gambling patterns are they're going to be enjoying funds. So, and then the other thing that people need to understand is that, casinos, managing a casino, a high performing casino is not only a science, but it's an art. And a lot of the people that are really good at it, they started right at the bottom of the casino. They moved their way up. What I've learned, and I really have a lot of respect for our executives, is like again, how much of it is an art and a science, and how much of it took, how much time and experience it took for them to get there. You can't really go to a college and teach you everything from day one. You can be a casino exec or even a mid-level person. So that was a big thing that I had to lean on these people to really understand this business.
So when you were an agent, did you work with casinos? Was that some of the work, or was that totally brand new? What got you to make a decision? Obviously, you make a decision to retire from IRS, but to move to that world. What drew you there? Had you had experience working with casinos for investigative purposes prior to that? Talk a little bit about your career path from that perspective.
Okay, so I landed as a special agent in charge for Las Vegas field office in 2009. I had not been in Vegas since my wife and I's honeymoon, 20 years prior. I don't really gamble, and so I come into this world of Vegas, really fascinated what really goes on in casinos. And here's the other thing, when I always tell law enforcement, don't watch the movie Casino and think that every casino, Robert De Niro is a GM and Joe Pesci is their AML officer. There's a lot of good people who are trying to do the right thing, and they have just as much interest in making sure our communities are safe and doing the right thing. So when I got to Vegas, I didn't know what was going on. But you fall into this trap of the stereotypes, and what you see on the movies, and people are saying, well, where's the money laundering going to the casino? So the smartest thing that I did, it was just kind of dumb luck. I decided, okay, look, I'm going to make a big effort to understand what's really going on in the casinos. And the first thing I did was I liaison and I partnered with the Nevada Gaming Control Board. And they have, at the time, they still do, they have all these seasoned investigators. And I let them educate me on the casinos. And we came up with this idea is like, there's so much to learn about casinos that we came up with a liaison program where I decided, look, we really need to be the subject matter expert about casinos if we're going to, in Vegas. So I assigned every one of my agents to a casino, and it was kind of the starting of these public-private partnerships. One was we really wanted to know what was going on, and number two, the casinos really wanted to tell us, so we understood, so we weren't leaning on the stereotypes. And so that allowed me, it was like 5 years of really partnering with casinos. And there were casinos that we investigated, but it really, really enhanced in me, really solidified the benefit of public-private partnerships.
Yeah, I mean, that's so important, even today, as we know. That's we've done other programming talking about the partnership forum we do in DC. We've had excellent connections with your former agency. IRS has been tremendous, and they do their own thing. This CI First program, which is great. During those 5 years that you were in charge, were there any particular cases that jump out at you, and just in terms of the typologies there that you remember that you want to mention?
Yeah, what's interesting, back then, one of our big focuses was illegal sports betting. And dealing with the organized crime elements, the organized crime groups that were facilitating their operations by what we call laying off bets, moving money in there. We also had these big players who were violating CTR requirements and trying to get their runners to move the line. It was a crazy time back then. And, I'd say that was one of our big focuses on money laundering threat. And it's interesting how a lot of that work my field office did laid the groundwork for subsequent bigger cases. And we're seeing now that illegal sports wagering is still a big deal.
Which seems interesting given that it's legal in most places to some degree, right? So it's
and that gets back to in the legal environment where there's robust regulations and an even playing field, how much you can mitigate that risk. But when you go into the legal market, especially when offshores, it has so much money laundering utility.
I want to ask you toward the end of our conversation your thoughts on prediction markets, but we'll do that toward the end. Just if you have any initial thought. I know they've been around for a while, but it's getting a lot more media play. But one of the things we talked about before we started to record today and the last time that we chatted was your theme about addiction regarding gambling and how that makes it a different type of a risk assessment, if you will, than a bank. Somebody that's simply trying to move money through a bank. So talk about that issue, the addiction issue, and how that's relevant to this space.
Yeah. So let me first start off to say the vast majority of people that go into casinos gamble responsibly, and there's a lot of statistics that it's a small percent. Usually, it's about 2% of the population that's predisposed to severe to gambling addiction. And so the vast people who show up in casinos, they have a good time. And, my mom used to occasionally go into casinos and she had a budget. And, when I walk to the casinos during the day, you just see a lot of people really enjoy it. That said, the casinos do have a unique money laundering risk, and that is gambling addiction. And if you look at this, there's a lot of stats out there that say that, people who are suffering from severe gaming addiction, when that majority of the time when they're asked about it, that they admit to committing some type of illegal act to fund their gambling. And
Right.
we've seen this in a lot of cases that have come out, especially in the sports wagering. The Otani case is a big example
Mhm.
of somebody who that interpreter, where there might have been in optics, well, that's just really Otani gambling. Well, no, if you understood really what was going on, and the IRS proved this with them working the case, is that their interpreter had an opportunity, remember the fraud triangle,
Right.
to embezzle from him. He did engage in money laundering because he disguised those transactions, but he was doing it to feed his gambling addiction. And when he was sentenced, he admitted to the gambling addiction. He was told to go to counseling on that. So yeah, so we have a subset, small set of our customers that will commit a crime to be our patrons. And you don't have that in banks where somebody is addicted to making deposits. Now it's
Right.
very small. Now, how does that play out in the assessment? Well, number one is that you have to lean more on your due diligence. So when you're doing due diligence, you have to remember the fraud triangle, the opportunity and motivation. Well, gambling and rationalizing, gambling addiction will rationalize it and it will incentivize it. Now you have to look for people who may, when you do the due diligence, people who may be financial gatekeepers, those things those are heightened. And so it does play. Now, I'm proud that I work for an organization that has a robust responsible gaming program. And, I look at that as a money laundering control that, when you're trying to help the community and help others, that you may also stop somebody or prevent somebody to committing a crime to feed their gambling.
Talking back, you mentioned a couple of times the fraud triangle for those that forget how
Yeah.
that works. Why don't you briefly describe that?
Well, the fraud triangle, I really like the fraud triangle for
Right.
teaching due diligence. And, there are three elements. Sometimes that people might say four because it talks about ability, but it is number one, it's the pressure. So you have pressure, and gambling addiction, just like drug addiction, could be the pressure. Then you have rationalization. So rationalization, for instance, when somebody is a gambling addict, that rationalization, and a big one is, well, I'm just going to win big and pay everybody off.
Mhm.
And then there's the opportunity. So you have pressure, rationalization, and opportunity. And opportunity, where is your hand close to a financial cookie jar, so to speak?
Mhm.
And it's interesting that, and I'm not just talking about casinos, when you look at that, the fraud triangle, what happened after COVID, when there was all these benefits that, you see the fraud triangle in play.
Sure. Sure.
And so when we teach due diligence to our folks how to do it, we lean on that fraud triangle that, when you're assessing the risk of a patron, think about the fraud triangle. Do they have an opportunity? Now, we don't assess if anybody is a gambling addict. We're not a clinician. That's not our job. Our job is just to take that risk under consideration.
All right, I want to get you to talk more a bit about training, but before I do, the National Money Laundering Risk Assessment that came out a couple of weeks ago does make a reference to gaming. Talk about that and some of the other trends that you're seeing. I know there's issues related to Chinese money laundering.
Yeah.
So talk a bit about that. What are some of the more current trends and some of the risks that were noted
Okay.
in the risk assessment?
Yeah. So if you look at that risk assessment, this is the first time that casinos are mentioned in the executive summary, and they link us with banks as the primary way is disguising the nature of funds. And that's an interesting angle about casinos. If you were to query AI and say, what's the easiest and cheapest way to launder money? Invariably, they're going to say, go to a bunch of different casinos, just layer all that. And all of a sudden for free, well, your cost is what you may lose. You have
Right.
a front, you have a disguise that it's not the smartest money laundering, but it does happen. So it is interesting that they put that in this summary. Now, like I said, the the most common way illicit funds enter the casino is through enjoyment. But that said, and that enjoyment, when you look at the money laundering risk assessment, it really leans heavily on fraud. So fraud is a big fraud and embezzlement. Now that's a big threat for casinos because people enjoying the fruits of it. But one of the key things that the National Money Laundering Risk Assessment resonates is cash. Cash
Right.
is if you the major takeaway is how risky cash in general is now in this economy, and in the context of the DOJ's biggest priority, which is drug trade organizations. And so, the threat is with cash is not necessarily that they may be coming. You know, you could have drug dealers, you could have people making the casino, you know, to disguise it, but just enjoying cash. And then it gets to the source of that currency. And then you throw in what has been a risk for casinos in the money laundering risk assessments since the last one is what we call Chinese money laundering networks. So, you know, those networks are used for a lot of purposes, but one of the purposes is folks who have wealth pocketed in China and they want to gamble it. And you know, we have to be, so it's now you have to be really focused on the source of currency. I know you have that business overseas, but how did you get that $100,000 or that $50,000 cash to come into the casino? So that's where we differentiate between source of cash and source of funds. But yeah, so you know, the risk assessment does, like I said, it highlights casinos. We always have that underlying risk that they can use this as a front. You know, we occasionally will have drug dealers and it looks like they're doing a bunch of different things. They get a casino, they get to enjoy their funds, they get to layer it amongst, and they may exchange small bills for large bills.
So part of your challenge, and you and your peers, is to stay on top of all this and have robust training so that depending on the skill level or the actual level of the person in your institution or the other institutions, that they are up to date on all these issues. Risk assessment is a clear way to do that as well. Talk a bit about your views on training, because training is so essential. It's one of the pillars, one of the AML pillars, obviously, and it's something that, you know, years ago was pretty brief, even for traditional financial institutions. It was a 20-minute online answer 5 questions or what have you, and that was not seen as adequate, and it's not. So what goes into your thought process, and how do you implement training both at your institution and how do your peers do it?
Well, I have an article coming out in ACAMS. It's basically, I think we kept the title, Don't Fly in the Check the Box Zone. And so my whole focus is to avoid a check the box operation when it comes to training. And you're right that for years, a lot of organizations, a lot of casinos have leaned on online training, push it out, and it made the auditors really happy. You know, they can look at the content of it and see, man, you were packing a lot of stuff, and man, you put a lot of questions in there. Great job on that. And you trained 100% of your people. Your training is like, whoa, man, you're flying high. Well, when you see a lot of these enforcement actually came out of Vegas, and with the gaming regulator, and even IRS has been. I've talked to IRS managers who would BSA, and a lot of them have started to complain about or worried about that training had become a check the box exercise, and that part of what happened in Vegas was because of this check the box. So my article highlights some best practices, and this is my best practice, what I think works well for us. Number one is we are competing with mind space. If you're trying to deploy any type of training in a casino, these casinos, the other thing people don't realize, you don't just open a door to a casino. They're highly overseen, really effective management. They really, they're managing sometimes by the minute to make sure you're giving top customer service. And so they're always getting training, and they're always hearing about not competing, but all these different priorities. So really, what we learned is our best way to deliver training for us to stand out is to do it in person as much as possible. Because the other thing you have to worry about with training is attention span. In this day and age, people they're trained and conditioned to have much smaller attention spans. So we found that in-person training, we get the engagement, we get the personal engagement, and that helps us expand the attention span. The other thing with in-person training is we learned another big component of in-person training is that you need to have room for Q&A, because there's no way you can train for every single situation that happens at casino. I mean, it's a casino. We're dealing with a lot of idiosyncrasies, and we have to vet those through, whether it's suspicious or that's the way they gamble. So we found by having, training where you have a Q&A and that you find out, it's the feedback loop. You might find out, wait a minute, they don't know this, or you're able to answer questions. So we're leaning on in-person training as much as we can. We want to tailor that training to that specific department. We want to figure out, we're not saying we know everything. The first thing we do is when we go to the department, we say, well, tell us what you think you need training on. Tell us about your operations. So we're partnering with them to figure out what they need the most, delivering it, always changing our training up if it's not hitting the right mark. We could have training that we develop in 1 month and realize, wait a minute, it's not working, and we flip it. So this idea is like, I'm going to come up with a model and it's going to be that for the whole year. We don't apply that. But the key to that is you got to have subject matter experts. You got to lean on your team members, develop them to be able to do that. Now, the benefit of this training is you develop your team members. So before, training was, we're just going to have it on online. Now you're not forcing, but you're creating this available opportunity for, number one, somebody to engage. So they're actually engaging with operations. They're not in an office. They're actually having this interpersonal developing relationship. And number two is they're actually presenting. And so we all know how important that is in our field. So they develop that. And number three, and this gets back to Confucius and Einstein and the Stoic wisdom, is that you really can master your job if you're forced to train it and articulate it in a simple way. So we still want to do online, but we're trying to make it so it's engaging. We always want to tell a story if we do online. It's got to tell a story. You got to really limit that content and make it engaging. We're in AML. We're in they make movies. They have Ozark. You have Breaking Bad. You have, Narcos. You name it. There's no reason that we can't make training about money laundering engaging and interesting. So, it's turning our models on the way that we would normally train. We're doing it, but I think it also goes to culture. So if you're engaging and you're out there training and you're showing that it's so important to me that that I'm actually going to go out there and train you, and then it goes to culture. So not only do we have training, what we'll do is then we supplement it where our team members will periodically go to team huddles or team departments just to be there, just to show we're partners. And I think holistically, that's how you get to your training program really firing and flying out of the no check the box zone.
Oh, that's great. Looking forward to reading that article. Before I end with a final question, any initial thoughts? Again, I know it's not that new, from your industry regarding the prediction markets, because it's getting a lot of publicity. I know Congress is considering guardrails or what have you, but just high level, not asking you for a political answer, but what are the general thoughts of the current gaming community regarding this group that's becoming part of that, but in a different way?
Well, the only thing I can speak to is money laundering threats.
There you go.
And so if you look at the general industry and you look at gaming, what all these products are doing is they're adding a lot more product on the online space. And so just from a risk-based perspective, whenever there's a product in gaming delivered, you just have to look at the regulatory environment. Is it robust enough, and to where it mitigates the money laundering risk. So when you open up online, and it may have an international element, and it may not have the same robust controls a regulation, then you're opening up opportunities for money, especially if it connects to the financial world. You're linking to the financial world, and and now in the world of setting up, with AI agents and, having multiple accounts and, it really, I think that, as we move, as you look at any gaming industry,
Sure.
you always have to look at it from what is the money laundering threat, what utility does it add? And so, that's what I leave you on. It's like,
Okay.
it appears that you could have a greater, you're expanding the money laundering opportunities, meaning you're going to have greater money laundering threats. And then, like just in banking, you really have to have robust regulations and a tight regulator to make sure that, we're protecting the financial systems.
I really appreciate all your insight. Let me get you out of here on this. You've given us a lot in this area, but what's the one thing, the one takeaway, if you will, that those of us that are in AML but not in gaming should understand about your community and your industry? You've given us a lot of that, but what's a takeaway, your quick elevator conversation for someone that doesn't have a lot of time and they say, Paul, what do we not know about AML in gaming besides all that you went through?
Well, I'll tell you, from tribal gaming, there's a lot, I can't speak for every
Sure.
casino, but what my observation is, there is a deep commitment from the tribes on down, understanding the importance of compliance. And a lot of that has to do with, there's a deep commitment to protecting and maintaining the reputation of the tribes, and a deep dedication to the communities they serve and keeping the community safe. So, a lot of my colleagues in tribal gaming, we feel very fortunate that, they've placed a high focus on doing the right thing and allowing us to build our programs the way we think will protect the organization. And then, the other thing, so you gotta understand that there are a lot of people. It is not the movie Casino. It is not Ozark. It doesn't make any sense because, your whole reputation is online, and so there's that. And you have to also understand that a lot of what we do in casino AML, unlike banks, is we rely on a lot of observation. When you think about a casino, most of the transactions are happening right on property, and most of them somebody may be able to observe. So it's not on the banking where you lie. The vast majority are online, and you have to run a lot of analytics to maintain to find suspicious activity. In
Right.
casinos, what we have to do is rely on a lot on observation and work collaboratively with with the security, with surveillance, with the cage, all these departments that we're coordinating our eyeballs, and and that gets to understanding what is normal gaming, what isn't. And the vast majority of people who come to casinos, because if you just look at the enforcement actions compared to other industries,
Right.
it's not like we're money laundering havens. So we want to do it in a manner where, people can come and enjoy the gaming, but we feel confident that we're watching. And so we're watching what we're supposed to be watching and reporting that. And so you're dealing with a lot of human intel, and that's where it gets back to where your training has to teach people to develop their spider sense. You can't just rely on an algorithm okay, we got this great analytic and it's just going to spit it out. It's going to be high productivity. No, a lot of times you're like, well, they told me this about what they do, or they were doing this, or, they were gambling this way. And you have to vet out where, no, they're doing that just because that's where they think their luck's going to be, So those are like the big things that people should understand about the casino industry. I'll leave you with this. Here's the big difference between my colleagues. A lot of my colleagues, they moved on to bigger positions in the finance world, in banking and in cyber and what have you. Really proud of them. But there's one thing I get to do that they can't do. And that is, when I need to take a walk or go get lunch or whatever, I love, walking around the parking lot around the casino. And one of my favorite things is to wish, especially when they're coming in the casino from the parking lot, is to wish them good luck. Because if you are in a tie and you're wearing a badge saying you work for Yamava and somebody says, hey, good luck, it makes their day. It just makes their day. And I love doing that and just seeing the reactions. It's like I'm handing out money.
Right.
But my colleagues in the banking world, they can't do that. They can't go in front of their bank, open up their door and say, as patrons come in, hey, good luck. That would not be good. So I get to say good luck and I get to enjoy that. So I'll leave you with that.
That's great. Paul Camacho, thank you so much for your time. We weren't going to talk about this today. We did last time a few years ago, but Paul is also intimately involved with the Mob Museum in Nevada. And if folks can Google that, take a look at that. If they're in Vegas anytime soon, it's a great opportunity to take a look at what's been put there, and also obviously enjoy yourself in Vegas as well. Paul, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
You're
Take
great.
care.